Challenge is good, but an overemphasis or focus on difficulty can often bring down or ruin an experience. As Loveless said in his Elden Ring critique, you have to understand that being difficult is not synonymous with being well designed, no matter how good it felt to finally overcome that challenge, because that feeling is ultimately completely subjective. Link in the description. The core of my argument against difficulty lies in player choice, creativity, freedom, etc., and whether or not those choices are effectively functionless. This is a very important point, so please keep it in mind. For any action or challenge, there is an objectively correct or best way to perform or overcome it. This is true even if we don't know of the best way to do something yet, and will often evolve as time goes on and more things are tested. There will always be a meta, you cannot escape that. If we are given, say, 10 guns in a first-person shooter, for every situation there will be a best weapon to pick from those 10, even if the player would prefer to pick another one. Now, difficulty. Difficulty will ideally push players towards the appropriate way to play a game. It's a guiding force to show them what is expected of them. The more you stray from the proper way to play a game, the harder things will be. A very simple way to visualize this is the first level of Super Mario Bros. This may seem like a dumb example, but please humor me. In Super Mario Bros., the first thing you have to do is run to the right, and you have a few options once you do. You can jump on or into the first block, or skip it and jump onto the row of blocks. But the inescapable fact is, you have to jump. If you don't jump, the game is literally impossible to beat. The proper way to play this part of the game, and every part after it, is by jumping. Now, very importantly, the difficulty of Super Mario Bros. Lies in the timer. Without the timer, the difficulty would lie simply in the player's ability to reach the end. The timer adds some tension. It gives the player a reason to perform beyond the absolute basics. Even saying that, the timer is very forgiving, and for most levels you'll probably never find yourself running out of time. The goal is to reach the end of the level without dying, and without the timer running out. That's all you have to do. Because the difficulty isn't quite so demanding, this offers the player a lot of choice in how they approach the level. And those choices, most importantly, are valid ones, so long as they don't die and they don't run out of time. Now, Super Mario Bros. Is a very simple game, and simple games typically handle higher difficulty easier, because the player is given less options than a more varied and dynamic games, something like Halo or Dark Souls, for example. But what happens when we cut the timer in half, or even a quarter? What if we force the player to finish the level in 60 seconds? What about 30? The lower this number is, the higher the difficulty would be, because it's demanding much more from the player, and in that demand, it is also demanding that they express less creativity, that they have less freedom, because they will ultimately be forced into the most effective way to traverse the level. They would be forced to play at a higher level, typically reserved for speedrunners. If that were the case, I feel like Super Mario Bros. Would have never been as popular as it is. I hope you can see where I'm going with this, but the harder a game is, the less freedom you are afforded. The easier a game is, the more freedom you're allowed. Now, like I said, challenge is good. Gamers typically like finding what is effective, and I think we can all find at least some enjoyment in figuring out when something works better than something else. It feels like we've discovered something, that we have agency, and through not only our hard work but our good decisions, we are not only winning, but winning well. Where this becomes a problem is when difficulty becomes so high that players are, basically, funneled into the same choices. It no longer becomes a special thing that you do when everyone else is doing it too. You're just playing the game how you're supposed to be playing. It's less of a game, more of a routine. Stand here, use this item, face this direction. You do these things because they're the most effective, and that might be fun to you, but I feel like that's a very bleak and boring way to play. I would argue that you're just following instructions. You're not really playing. I found a comment on a Reddit post, I know, disgusting, anyways, from 12 years ago, in which the user, deleted, says, paraphrased, "I think people want harder games because they don't understand what they want," which is something that I wholeheartedly agree with. They go on to say, "The underlying problem is seen as games are too easy, but it's not just that making them harder would fix anything. It's not difficulty that's missing, it's game mechanics that make the game fun to play and replay. mechanics that force you to pay attention and that generate consequences that are interesting. They even talk about the one and only Souls game, saying, "People always hold up Demon's Souls because it's hard. But it's not good because it's hard. It's good because it has a combat system that rewards paying attention and learning patterns. When you die in Demon's Souls, there's a reason for it, and you can learn to avoid it." And there's that agency I mentioned before. Unfortunately, as I've tried to make clear, as difficulty goes up and up, our freedom of creativity and our agency will go down and down. In Demon's Souls, generally speaking, as long as you're careful and use your head, you can probably work your way out of most situations, and that's very satisfying. I firmly believe that difficulty, when used properly, can help make a game more satisfying to play rather than less. But when used improperly, can only serve to frustrate and disappoint players, leaving them feeling like their time has been wasted. It's funny how we went from games disrespecting our intelligence by being so mind-numbingly easy, to a game that seemed to go against that norm that was a breath of fresh air, Dark Souls, or Demon's Souls. And now I fear we're on the other side of the extreme, where games are now disrespecting our time. Like I said, challenge is fine. It can force us to think outside of the box. It can make us say, "Oh, that thing that's worked so well so far isn't really working. I need to take a step back and use more of my tools," which is good. I believe that a game that gives you 10 guns should give you a reason to use every single one of those guns at some point in time. Doom Eternal does a pretty damn good job of this, as an example, and so does Ultrakill. In fact, let's use games like Ultrakill, and even one I played recently called Echo Point Nova, two very high-speed games focusing on using the right gun for the right situation, as well as making good use of your mobility options. If you were to die in one hit in either one of these games, you would have to play the game in a much different way, focusing more on safety than aggression. Generally speaking, the less forgiving a game is, the less room you give the player to use and play with mechanics that are not the most objectively effective way to play. And the more room for mistakes you give the player, the more room you give them to mess around, to do silly tricks, to play your game, and to have fun, which should ultimately be the goal of almost every video game ever made. In Echo Point Nova, if my character dies in one shot, I'll treat it more like a tactical military shooter and hide behind cover as much as I can, since my margin for error is so incredibly slim. You can actually see this in some of their challenge missions where you do die in one shot, or you can't heal like you normally can. It changes the way you have to play in a very dramatic way. It can be fun and novel as a challenge here or there, but if the whole game was played like this, it would demand a much higher level of perfection from players, and most of them would probably not even use the high mobility and stylish gameplay that you spent so much time working on. Elden Ring is an extreme example of difficulty gone wrong, though I will say some of the fights are way better than others. For every single boss, there is an objectively correct way to kill them as quickly and safely as possible. Unfortunately, there are thousands of combinations of items at the player's disposal. Thousands of build varieties in terms of stat distribution, weapon and armor and talismans, etc. Having so many choices is, generally speaking, a very good thing. It allows the player to play the way they want to live out a fantasy of their own creation, to be an archer, a thief, a warrior, a mage, to truly be themselves and express themselves within this massive level of freedom. And then you get to a boss fight and find out that your favorite spell or weapon or skill is actually not very good against them. This is inevitable. In any game with any amount of choice and any amount of challenges to overcome, you will need to balance all of those around each other. And it's literally impossible to make a perfectly balanced game that is also as highly dynamic as something like Elden Ring or even Monster Hunter. That being said, you can try to get as close as you can, and you cannot make the game too terribly difficult without compromising challenge. Here's a quote from Miyazaki about the difficulty of Dark Souls 1. I know, very unique of me to bring this up. "We are trying to create a game that is spicy, and we want to make it as spicy as possible, but still edible, and also to make it taste good that leaves you wanting more." I've spent a long time thinking about difficulty in video games and the problems I often have with it, and I doubt this will be my only video talking about it, unfortunately. These are the conclusions I've come to recently. I've been wanting to talk about it for some time, but I'm not the best at putting my thoughts into words, so hopefully this all made sense. I know difficulty is a difficult thing to talk about, because oftentimes people will just say you're bad at video games, instead of actually thinking about it. I think it's very much worth examining yourself, and why you may or may not be seeking out challenging games in the first place. as I think ego can play a very large role in it. You may be trying to find something that you lack in some other part of your life. I'm not smart enough to go into that. Go ask ChatGPT or whatever you kids do nowadays. I'm not saying that people can't like or appreciate a high challenge, but I'm sure there's usually more to it for most people. I can say for sure, that's how it went when I was younger, when I was seeking out games like Dark Souls and Monster Hunter. I was thinking, if I can conquer these games, then I'm surely not as bad as I think I am. Or I'm surely worth the time of others, worthy of attention and admiration, worthy of love. Unfortunately, no one gives a shit if you beat Gwyn at Soul Level 1. When everyone's impressive, no one is impressive. You gotta find another way to gain the admiration of others, and realize that it's okay to want that kind of thing. It's very normal. This kind of thing, chasing dragons, as it were, won't work, and even if it does, it's not really gonna last. The people you impress will just find something more impressive eventually. There's always a bigger fish. You'll always be chasing a more difficult challenge to one-up the competition, or even just yourself. It'll never be enough. The sooner you realize that, the better. One thing I can say for sure is that nobody else in the world is you, and that's more special than you might think. Anyways, I'll see you later.